In Venezuela, it's been a little over a week since the country's presidential election, and nothing is settled.
Bandera, bandera, bandera de Venezuela, porque...
Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, said that he won the July 28th election. 2 days later, he celebrated by singing a patriotic song about Venezuela and its flag to a crowd at the presidential palace in Caracas.
Bandera de Venezuela, porque yo te quiero tan...
But not everyone is celebrating with him. A growing number of observers say, no, Maduro did not win the election. The opposition leader, Edmundo González, is calling Maduro's victory a fraud. And González is saying the opposition will fight back.
Nuestra lucha continúa y no descansaremos hasta que la voluntad del pueblo de Venezuela sea respetada.
We've spent the past few days working as a team to try to do our own review of these vote tallies that have been collected by Venezuela's opposition.
Samantha Schmidt is the Bogota bureau chief for The Post. She reported from Venezuela on its election. Along with other colleagues from The Post, she has reviewed thousands of vote tallies.
And I went through a cardboard box that had hundreds of them in Caracas and, felt them and reviewed them myself to be able to say, these match what the opposition is posting online. These appear to be legitimate. And according to these records, it is very likely that Maduro lost the election.
As the controversy surrounding the election continues, people have taken to the streets throughout Venezuela and clashed with security forces. As of Monday afternoon, around 11 people have been killed in protests. Venezuelans are chanting, "We are not afraid." Maduro is doubling down, and he has called the protesters criminals. He said, "Let's go after them."
¡Vamos por todos los criminales! ¡Vamos por todo!
We have never seen him do something like this. If what the opposition is telling us is true, this would be the most brazen electoral fraud we've seen in Venezuela and really in South America in many years.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, August 5th. Today, the fallout from Venezuela's presidential election. We'll hear about the Post's investigation into the vote tallies and how Maduro is responding to the global pushback against his claim of victory. So, Sam, as we said, Venezuela's election took place 2 Sundays ago on July 28th. And since then, Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, is claiming that he won. And that is a claim that is increasingly contested. We're going to dive into a lot more about that. But before we get there, can you just tell me a little bit more about Nicolás Maduro, who he is, and what led up to this moment?
Yeah, he was essentially handpicked by Hugo Chavez, the founder of Venezuela's socialist state, to be his successor. And this was back in 2012, 2013. And he basically was the vice president to Hugo Chavez when he died. And in an election in 2013, he was elected president. And since then, he has consolidated his power and really taken Venezuela into an authoritarian place that even Hugo Chavez had not taken it. He's been accused of, internationally, of severe human rights violations, of repressing political opponents, of, jailing dissidents. He has managed to control most of the institutions in the country, including the courts, the military, the Electoral Council, and he's been in power for more than a decade now. And this election presented what has been until now his biggest challenge yet.
So then who has been opposing him in this election?
In the months leading up to the election, the opposition held a primary to be able to choose a candidate. And the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, won it with more than 92% of the vote. So she was very clearly the chosen candidate. But Venezuela's government did not allow her to run. She's actually been banned from holding public office.
Why not? Why wasn't she allowed to run?
She's one of many opposition leaders who's had a bar against running for public office because of accusations from many years ago of corruption, which we don't have a basis for. But basically, this is a tool that the Venezuelan government uses to disqualify and prohibit opposition leaders from running. And it's something that has been happening repeatedly over the years. And usually in previous elections, it has led to, the opposition basically abstaining from the elections, boycotting them, or they haven't been able to figure out sort of how to respond and how to unify behind one candidate. What's so remarkable is that this time they managed to basically say, okay, we're not gonna run with Maria Corina Machado, but Maria Corina Machado said, we're going to have a substitute candidate. And they picked a substitute candidate basically at the last minute to register. And his name is Edmundo González. And he was very much basically an unknown figure in Venezuela, a soft-spoken diplomat who most people did not know. And suddenly he became Venezuela's best hope to beat Maduro. But really the driving force in this campaign from the beginning was Maria Corina Machado. And she's been the one who's been rallying massive crowds across the country in caravans. And she really continues to be the face of the campaign, even though Edmundo González was the candidate.
Ese día, los testigos, los miembros de mesa.
So Maria Corina Machado is speaking at a rally in Caracas, and she's describing what has been a remarkable feat by the opposition, which is to gather 80% of these voting receipts so that the whole world can know that they really won.
Y esa verdad que nosotros sabíamos antes del 28, hoy la sabe el mundo entero.
Sam, it sounds like there are a lot of reasons that Venezuelans might be dissatisfied and upset with how Maduro has led the country in recent years. What is the opposition saying in terms of what they promise would change if they were to get into power?
The driving message of the opposition's campaign from the beginning has been focused on the Venezuelan diaspora. About a quarter of the population has fled the country, more than 7 million people. And just about any Venezuelan knows someone or has a family member, a loved one who lives abroad, many of them in the U.S. And the message is simple. If you vote for us, if we win, we will reunite your families and we will bring your children home. And that has been a powerful message. And she believes that even some Chavistas, even some people who support the government, who also have relatives abroad, might believe this and might want this themselves.
So Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo González, who's actually the opposition candidate who is on the ballot, they are both saying that they have documented proof that the opposition did in fact win this election and that what Nicolas Maduro has put out is wrong. What is the proof that they're talking about? And is there actual documentation that suggests that the Venezuelan government isn't being honest about the results of this election?
To explain this proof, I need to sort of set up what the opposition did to make this happen, because it's truly stunning what they did. They managed to recruit thousands of volunteers to be at voting centers the night of the vote, and these witnesses, as they call them, were accredited by the government to be there and to receive the actual receipts at the end of the night, proving at each voting table who won. And they knew that there could be a high chance that Nicolas Maduro would try to tamper with this vote. And so this was what they thought was their best protection against that. And it wasn't enough to just have these voting witnesses there at each center, but they needed to get the actual piece of paper at the end of the night. And once they got that piece of paper, they would give it to what they called a sort of captain, which would then bring it to a secret location where they would scan each receipt and upload it to the opposition's app so that they could very quickly figure out who won and have the actual scanned photo of each receipt.
So it sounds like the idea here was to basically have a paper trail at each location in each part of the election to make sure that there was like documented proof wherever people were voting of what was actually happening.
Yeah, and these receipts are printed off by the machine. The electoral system is actually very high tech in Venezuela, and when you vote, it goes into a machine, and that at the end of the day, that machine prints off the results, the tally. These are literally the tabulations of each polling station. And there are 25,000 of these receipts, and the opposition has collected more than 80% of them.
So what do these receipts tell us?
These receipts, which are now uploaded to the opposition's website, show us that Edmundo González received more than twice the number of votes as President Nicolás Maduro. And our own analysis of most of these tallies show that González earned 67% of the vote compared to Maduro's 30% of the vote. And that's coming from 23,720 tally sheets that we managed to analyze. So this was a team effort, and my colleague, who's a data reporter in DC, Stephen Rich, he managed to extract and analyze data from the vast majority of these tally sheets. I, myself, was able to look through hundreds of these physical pieces of paper and was able to confirm that they matched what we were seeing online from the opposition, and that, you know, they had several different characteristics that made them seem very legitimate. And that's how we were able to sort of, in our own way, verify these results. However, we weren't able to independently, fully confirm that these were authentic, because the only way we could do that is if we had government data and government results, which we have not been able to get.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just point out here that it's not just you all, that the Associated Press has done an examination of these documents, that the NGO, the Carter Center, has done this, that there is sort of widespread agreement at this point internationally that if you look at what the documents show, that the Maduro administration is not being truthful here.
I should mention that the Carter Center, while they didn't do their own analysis of this, they were one of the only independent observation missions in Venezuela for the elections, and they specifically said that these elections could not be considered democratic. And there was also a separate effort, a Caracas-based group that basically took its own independent sample of these voting records. And they were also able to reach very similar conclusions, which also align very closely with exit polling that we got from very reliable exit pollers the night of the vote. So this has been corroborated from many different sides. Mm-hmm. But the one thing we are missing is the government's response.
Why hasn't the government just released the receipts themselves, or how have they been able to continue to maintain that they won?
So from the beginning, they blamed this on a hack that happened, a cyber attack. And from the night of the vote, the CNE, the National Electoral Council of Venezuela, their website has been down for over a week. You can't even go in to the website. And on the night of the vote, electoral officials said that there was a cyber attack, presumably from North Macedonia. North Macedonia has denied this, and we have spoken with several experts who have said that there was no interruption in the transmission of results, and that the system worked, and that it would have been very, very difficult to hack because they use their own independent direct lines. They use telephone lines that don't rely on internet. And frankly, at the end of the day, despite this cyber attack, the government still put out what it said were reliable results on the night of the election. And several days later, they put out slightly different numbers that were more specific to the decimal. And yet they haven't actually released any of the precinct level results to say in each of these municipalities, in each of these states, this is how much we won. These are the number of votes. And what they've done instead is a few days ago, last week, Maduro basically went to the courts and claimed that there were attacks against the electoral system and violence that affected the ability to get results. He has said that he's going to turn in all of the results to the court so that they can resolve this. But of course, this court is also controlled by Maduro. So it appears as though the strategy they're going to use is they're going to try to get this court to uphold the results. And he has not said whether he's going to release any of these results publicly.
So given all this, and given the perception that there's a lack of transparency here from the government, that fraud might have taken place, how are Venezuelans responding to this?
From the moment the results were announced on that Monday morning, very early, I could hear from my hotel room in Caracas the sound of what are called cacerolas, which is pots and pans banging from people's windows. And people shouting, libertad, libertad, freedom, freedom. I mean, from the beginning, you could tell there was an outpouring of frustration. And hours later, people took to the streets, and there were protests in places where we've very rarely seen protests in Venezuela, in some of the barrios, the working class neighborhoods that were seen as the strongholds of Chavismo and of Maduro. And people were very angry. And while those have sort of ebbed and flowed in the days since, the focus has been very resolute on, we have the proof, we want to see the government's numbers. And the opposition has been very focused on the paper trail that they've been able to get. And the response from the international community has also been pretty remarkable, in that even Maduro's allies in the region have demanded that he release the results.
Sam, I understand that our colleague Ana Vanessa Herrero was out there talking to some of these protesters, individuals who decided that they needed to be out on the streets to express how angry and frustrated they were with the situation. Can you talk through, some of the voices that we heard there?
On that first day of protests, the Monday after the vote, she spoke with people who came down from some of these mountainside barrios who, even among Venezuelans who live in Caracas, they were seeing this happen and they thought, this is remarkable, that this never happened. And what people were starting to say in those protests was, I'm tired of this. It's not worth it. I'm willing to risk my housing, my food. This no longer is enough. And I think that it's a sign that, there's been a real shift in Venezuela.
A lo que vivimos el día 28, que fue algo masivo, que todo el pueblo venezolano salió a votar para un cambio.
This is Rafael Gutierrez, a 30-year-old mechanic, and he says he was protesting the vote peacefully when government security forces arrived and started firing tear gas. And he said, on Sunday, a massive outpouring of Venezuelans voted for change, for a better future, and now the government is responding with repression.
Y esta es la manera en que ellos nos responden, reprimiendo.
And there's also Edmundo González, a 25-year-old, who said the security forces sent out by Maduro grabbed people, tore their shirts. He said he saw them hit a woman and beat down an elderly man.
Nos rompieron las camisas, nos pegaron. A una dama le pegaron, a un señor de la tercera edad lo cayeron a cachazo y le pegaron.
He said, we need peace, liberty, and truth. We just need change.
Exigimos paz, libertad y verdad. Por favor, queremos una transición.
And has Maduro said anything about the actions that he's taken against these protesters?
Yeah, he has accused them essentially of terrorism, of trying to incite a civil war. He's blamed this on the opposition leaders, Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo González. He's blamed it on the U.S. He says that they are trying to attack the electoral system and that they're trying to incite violence in Venezuela. And that what he is doing is trying to, resolve this in the courts. And I actually asked Maduro himself about this at a press conference on Wednesday at Miraflores Presidential Palace.
Gracias. Usted ha proclamado una victoria contundente. Venezuela también dice que tiene el mejor sistema electoral en el mundo. ¿Cómo usted justifica al pueblo venezolano que no se haya publicado aún los resultados detallados de cada centro electoral, como siempre se había hecho durante los años de Chávez? Muchas gracias.
I said, Mr. President, you have declared a victory, and Venezuela has also said that it has one of the best electoral systems in the world. So how do you justify to the Venezuelan people the fact that you still haven't released results at the local level many days after the election despite the fact that this has always been released, even in the years of Chavez.
Ahorita, esta hora que estamos hablando, está bajo ataque cibernética. Le destruyeron los sistemas desde el punto de vista cibernético. Y están en este momento los técnicos y los ingenieros luchando. Por eso es que, mira, Washington Post, en Venezuela hay leyes.
He blames this on the attacks on the electoral system offices, regional offices that he says were under attack the night of the vote. He blames it on a cyber attack. He then says, Washington Post, there are laws in Venezuela, and the Supreme Tribunal of Justice will resolve everything. And we will not allow lies to be imposed on us. We will not allow people to call for violence. This is simple. There's a Supreme Tribunal of Justice, and they will have the final word.
What did you make of that response?
It's interesting because this was hours after he had gone to, I saw him actually go to the Supreme Tribunal of Justice. And, it just became clear to me that he's going to be trying to use the courts once again to uphold his actions. Again, he's just relying on sort of the same explanation that we've heard so far.
After the break, I talk with Sam about the international response to Maduro and what is next for the opposition. We'll be right back. So, Sam, you talked about some of the international outcry that has followed this election, even among countries that are considered closer or maybe allies with Venezuela. Can you talk a little bit more about what are the countries that we're seeing come out against Maduro in this and why this is so significant?
Yeah, so we're in an interesting moment in South America because most of the leaders are leftists. And there had been a lot of hope from the U.S. and from the international community that these leftist leaders who have friendlier relations with Maduro could help, pressure him to negotiate. And what we're seeing is that presidents of Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico and their foreign ministers have been working together to try to bring Maduro to the negotiating table. They have all demanded that Maduro release his results. In particular, Colombia and Brazil have been sort of in the leading roles of this. Brazil had a high-level foreign policy advisor in Caracas during the vote who actually met with Maduro at the presidential palace shortly after. And their statements so far publicly have not gone as far as the U.S. and other countries to recognize that Edmundo González won the election. They have not gone that far, but they have said that there needs to be transparency in Venezuela, that Maduro needs to release the results, and there is a lot of hope that they might be able to get him to negotiate.
Interesting. And I want to dive into the U.S. on this, too. Sam, as you just mentioned, the Biden administration has been pretty vocal on this. Right after the election, Secretary of State Antony Blinken voiced some concerns.
We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people.
And then a few days later, Blinken actually stated that the U.S. government was formally recognizing Edmundo González, the opposition, as the winner. But I want to talk a little bit about what led to this moment. Because one of the reasons why this election came about, one of the reasons there was an election with an opposition candidate, was it was part of a deal that the U.S. made with Venezuela, that the Biden administration would lift sanctions against Venezuela's state-run oil and gas industry in exchange for a competitive, fair election. So now that we're seeing these charges that Maduro might be trying to steal the vote, what happens now? What are the possible scenarios here, including what the U.S. might consider doing to put more pressure on Maduro's government?
So it's still unclear exactly how the U.S. is going to respond. I think they are waiting to see what happens in the coming days and whether the Latin American leaders are able to bring Maduro to the table. Biden administration officials have said they're continuing to assess their sanctions policy. And so far, it seems that they are willing to maintain these licenses, these sort of ongoing deals that are happening with individual oil companies. It's unclear if they're going to lift any of those, or backtrack on any of those. And they're trying to walk a fine line here. But I understand that there are still many things on the table that the U.S. could at least consider offering to Maduro. And I think that they just have to tread very carefully. And many sources have told me that they're skeptical of U.S. negotiations with Venezuela right now, at least in the short term, because of the statement released by Blinken a few days ago, in which while he does not formally recognize González as president-elect, he does say that he won the election and that it is clear that he won more votes than Maduro. And even that statement is sure to upset the Venezuelan government and might make it harder to negotiate in the coming days.
So what are the next possible steps here?
We're waiting to see what the opposition does. They have not gone as far as to call for mass protests in the streets. They have gathered people for rallies in Caracas, and there have been sort of organic protests so far, but they have ebbed and flowed. Some days they've been bigger than others. It's unclear whether there's going to be a sustained large protest movement to this. It's unclear what's going to happen next in the courts. And that will also, I think, make clear some of the other options that Maduro is considering. I mean, there are so many different scenarios still. There are people who believe that Maduro could try to, call for new elections, that he could try to, in some way claim that these results were not reliable. He could try to sort of annul the results. It's still very unclear what's going to happen next. And I think it's going to depend a lot on whether any of these attempts to negotiate are successful. It's going to depend on whether the military continues to stand behind Maduro. And there are indications that Maduro is frustrated. He's been lashing out at some of his staff, even in his public comments and in press conferences. He has sounded quite angry. But they are trying to, as much as possible, continue to push the argument that this was an attack. And in the meantime, they are repressing protests and arresting more than 2,000 people who are involved in protests or who are associated with the opposition in some way. There is a great deal of fear, unlike any I've heard of in Venezuela in many years.
Why do you think that level of fear is more acute now than what you've seen before?
I think because if what all of the indications are showing us are true, this is brazen. And this is somebody who is no longer necessarily concerned about maintaining an image of democratic legitimacy. And he has been arresting people at a very high level, and in all of the public comments, blaming it on the opposition, blaming what he says is violence and a civil war on those associated with the opposition and on these protests. They've seen the repression from the Maduro government many times before in protests over the years, and have seen how so many people have died, have been jailed, have been forced to leave the country as a result of security forces' repression on protesters and on dissidents. So I think there's a great deal of fear, and I think that could really hamper the momentum and the willingness that Venezuelans have to go out into the streets and protests.
Sam, thank you so much for all your reporting on this, and thank you for talking me through it.
Thank you so much.
Samantha Schmidt is the Bogota bureau chief for The Post. You also heard reporting from our colleague Ana Vanessa Herrero. The Post is reporting on so many other stories today. So before we go, here are a couple that you really need to hear about. Global financial markets have gone into a tailspin. This morning, the Dow Jones dropped nearly 1,000 points after investors sold off stock in a panic. European markets suffered too, and Japan's Nikkei index had its biggest single-day drop on record. Why is this happening? There are a number of reasons, including a jobs report last week that showed a slowdown in the U.S. labor market. This moment has sent Wall Street's so-called fear gauge to its highest levels since March 2020. And now, analysts are once again worried about a U.S. recession. And if you're like me, you were watching a lot of track and field at the Olympics over the weekend. There were so many thrilling moments, like Team USA's Noah Lyles winning his race in a photo finish. But my favorite part was seeing all these athletes having just won gold, jogging over to this big bell and banging the heck out of it. What you might not have realized if you were watching is that this isn't just any old bell. After the Olympics and Paralympics, this bell is going to Notre Dame Cathedral. It will be one of the bells placed high in the cathedral's roof. And in December, when Notre Dame officially reopens years after it was nearly destroyed by a fire, this Olympics bell will be rung. According to a Paris 2024 official, it was an appropriate way to show that, quote, the sound of victory will remain in Notre Dame. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you're looking for the latest updates on the big news of the day, check out our morning news briefing, The 7. We bring you through the 7 stories that you need to know about every weekday morning by 7 a.m. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Sabby Robinson and Ali Bianco. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell. Thanks also to Stephen Rich, Maria Luisa Paul, Matt Brown, and Abba Batarai. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.